or something.
Back to order
And so-
and end our recess and come back.
We'll know that I'm-
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. Of course, I think now we have the live streaming on. If anything develops, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll continue on. And I think the first item for this administrative committee meeting, I believe, is behind tab C, which will be the proposed board and committee schedule for 2025. As you can see, this is put together similar to the past and similar to this past year, with basically the board meeting being, in most cases, the fourth Wednesday of each month. And you can see the dates and the days outlined there for the regular board meetings, as well as those for any claims committees that are needed and investment committee, the additional ones, should that be needed. Usually it's just the main regular meetings, but with that, we would like to ask for the board's approval of the schedule.
Any questions? Do we have a motion to approve?
Motion.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right, the next item is behind tab D, and this will include the runoff election results for one of the state employee representatives. And you can see the information there. And before I make the recommendation for the board to certify the results, would like to thank and congratulate Mr. Alan Cooper on a hard race. We certainly appreciate his past and ongoing support of PERS and wish him the best in the future. And then also would like to congratulate Terrence Yarbrough, subject to the board certification, for winning the runoff election. We certainly appreciate the history involved here with him being a former PERS employee, and certainly congratulate him. Look forward to working with him in the future. And with that, would be happy to answer any questions, but otherwise just congratulate and welcome him and ask for the board to certify the results of the election, with Terrence Yarbrough being the new board member.
Do we have any discussion? Do we have a motion?
Well, we can't say no.
I guess we could, but I don't know that that'd be.
Some people would say you can, but go ahead.
We voted, what are we voting on?
We certified the election results.
Yeah.
We certified the election results and,
Well, what if we didn't?
well,
They'd have to go back and
go back to
recount 'em.
January 6th, 4 years ago, and we'll say,
Is Donald Trump on this board?
They would be looking, the company would be looking for hanging chads and other stuff like that, so.
We have a motion from Commissioner Dale. Do we have a second? I have a second. Any discussion? Any other discussion? All in favor, by aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
All right, thank you for that, and I think he'll be a great board member, and I believe we're planning on swearing him in later on this afternoon after the board meeting, if anybody wants to hang around. The next item is, if we can, I talked with the committee chairman, and even though the agenda has it one way, we're actually going to switch this around and have GRS with the additional independent actuarial assessment go first, and then CAVMAC with the regular valuation projection will come second. So next up is our partners from GRS, and as they come up and make their way here, we're going to hear from Danny White and Cassie Rappaport with GRS. Again, GRS is one of the additional independent actuaries, similar to the work that Chiron did last year. As I mentioned before, GRS, similar to CAVMAC, is one of the largest in the country with a lot of experience with public pensions nationwide, and they've also done work for the state in the past. And with that, hopefully they've had a chance to transition, and I will turn it over to them.
Yeah, if I could have help with, as they work through the technology. Again, I'm Danny White, this is Cassie Rappaport. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's our first time presenting with PERS. I want to say it's a pleasure to be here. You've got a great office building, such a location to the state capitol. I guess it says the importance of PERS to the state government. So, is our screen up yet?
All right. One thing too I'll mention as they're doing that, you should have a hard copy in your notebook too, I believe. Maybe, not.
It's under F.
F, you said, okay.
F behind the blue, the old blue sheet in F.
All right. F behind the blue sheet. And also, as they do that, let me just mention this too. Of course, we look forward to hearing from them today, and we'll be in good hands. But just to give you a little bit of background, One of the other lead actuaries on the project is Paul Wood, and unfortunately, he was unable to be here today just simply due to a very important scheduling conflict that couldn't be avoided, combined with our need to have the reports as far as the draft reports and the preliminary results in October. But hopefully you'll get a chance to meet him in the future. I know some of you have before at various conferences or events. And on that, GRS is one of the firms like CAVMAC and Chiron that you'll often see on panels or making presentations at national events or national conferences and working on actuarial matters and advising systems as well as the standards board. I apologize for the technical difficulties, as always the case.
Okay.
It seems like there's always a little bit of a challenge, but if you'll bear with us, we should have it up momentarily.
There we go. All right, everybody see your screen? All right, very good, thank you.
Actually, hold on, almost.
We had it for a second.
Okay.
And I know it was tested, there we go.
There we-
I know it was tested previously, so
Always-
we always try to do what we can to avoid
Means
this.
nothing.
It's
Now it's
always with technology, so,
Is it plugged in? Is it stable as far as the connection?
Oh, it just went out.
It's going back and forth, it looks like.
Don't move.
all right, very good. So as you receive an actuary report, retained actuary provides a lot of financial information, very detailed information, and no matter how much information or disclosure or numbers you put in a report, it's a very specialized report, and it's really hard to get into to understand how transparent it is, and it's a lot of specialty in the calculations. So when you have such type of arrangement or financial condition, one of the things to get a sound understanding of the results and get confidence in the results is to have an actuarial audit report, actuarial audit performed. And so these are commonly done by statewide retirement systems. PERS itself, had an actuarial audit performed in 2022. And then again, you've had 2 independent assessments done this year on the 2024 val. So what this does is the idea is you have the results by your consulting actuary presenting their results. The information we're presenting today, which provides a comparison to CAVMAC's results, is these are independently calculated. So these are siloed off. We receive the same data that's received by CAVMAC, same financial information, and independently we're coming up and calculating the same type of financial information. So in terms of the scope of the review, I would put it to, we evaluate the data. Is the data that's being that's being provided to CAVMAC and, in the actuary, is it appropriate? Is it complete? Is it in the sense of, is there any additional data items that could be better used to refine the valuation process? In terms of the validation of the results, of course, are very important. This next one on reconcile significant differences. As you probably saw with the 2022 audit, there was some time period to compare those differences. In that sense of timing, the actuarial valuations performed, then there's an audit on those val results. This one's unique. This audit process was unique in terms of the timing, in that they were independently done at the same time. So this idea of being able to reconcile discrepancies that time really wasn't available in here. So it really came to I would call it 2 blind valuations. One valuation performed by Chiron, then us, and then your consulting actuary. And there wasn't much time. There was about a week or 2 to discuss if there were any differences. But what we found is we came in close. We came in very close. So that should give additional confidence in the results that's being provided can be used for decision-making purposes. As we get further into the scope on the 2024, of course, you're going to evaluate the contents of the report. Another big one's the reasonableness of the demographic and economic assumptions. I think the assumed rate of return is a big topic that came up, just from reading minutes and whatnot and what's in the popular press. And also look at the funding objectives. So we provide comment on, we perform the projections on our own, and that's an important part of this, this audit, again, that's maybe a little different than others. Instead of just stopping at the VAL report, we also independently performed a 30-year projection. Now, in that, we do get, there's some additional assumptions that are built in, namely, what's this new entrant profile? What do you expect new entrants to come in to look at? So we relied on the consulting actuary for some of that input for similarities, but beyond that, those 30-year projections are also independent. If we go to the primary conclusions, and so I'm going to read the first topic by bullet because I want to get it in the minutes and have it documented that based on a review of the census data, experience study document, and the actuary reports, the full valuation replication, we believe that the 2024 actuarial evaluation for PERS is reasonable based on reasonable assumptions and methods, and the report generally complies with actuarial standards of practice. So the reason of this important, this is essentially your note, you have a clean audit. This would be considered a clean audit, if you were looking at other, other type audit purposes. In terms of the actuarial standards of practice, for those who aren't familiar with in terms of actuarial work, this is the code of conduct and the principles that we adhere to in terms of conducting our business and conducting our services. So, in addition to that, and as part of the scope of the audit that was requested, we also need to comment that we believe that CABMAC and their valuation reports, the projected financial information to PERS to be appropriate, and we concur with the system's needs in terms of additional contributions are necessary to be sustainable. So, in that you have the statutory contributions coming in versus what's in the funding policy. We believe that based on those projections that CABMAC's comments and disclosures in that are appropriate, and we concur with those. So with that, I'm going to turn it over with Cassie, but please, as we go through this information, if there are questions along the way, we're welcome to take those as they may come.
All right. Thank you, Danny, and good morning, everyone. So as Danny mentioned, part of the actuarial audit is reviewing the assumptions that were used. So in order to do that, we did review the experience study that CABMAC prepared back in 2022. And actuarial assumptions are important because over time, the true cost of benefits will depend on actual experience. But in order to prepare the valuation and those 30-year projections, we need to make assumptions as to what will happen in the future. And the closer we are with the assumptions and how that lines up with actual experience, that will prevent gains and losses and volatility in the plan funding from year to year. So they do serve as kind of a foundation for the valuation process. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the actuarial assumptions? At the top here, we have the economic assumptions, which includes price inflation, payroll growth rate, and the investment return assumption. The investment return assumption is extremely important. It is used to discount future expected benefit payments, and it's used to actually determine and calculate the liabilities for the plan. The demographic assumptions are related to participants and their behavior. So we have things like retirement rates, termination rates, disability, mortality, and salary increases. So an example would be, when are people actually going to retire? What age? What service? Will they make it to retirement, or will they terminate prior to that? All of these go into the valuation and help us to calculate those final liabilities. And then at the bottom here, we have the valuation methodologies. So the amortization policy, the actuarial cost method, which is the entry age normal, and the asset valuation method, which CABMAC does use a 5-year smoothing on the assets. And we agree with all of those methodologies and find them to be reasonable and appropriate for Mississippi PERS. In reviewing the demographic assumptions, it's important to look at past experience. What are participants for this plan specifically doing? So we found that the demographic assumptions from the last experience study were reasonable. CAPMAC did look at prior experience. They made slight adjustments where they were needed, and we did not see any significant patterns of gains and losses since that study assumptions were implemented. For the economic assumptions, unlike the demographic assumptions, we want to look at more forward-looking expectations rather than past experience. We found these economic assumptions to be reasonable, especially that investment return assumption, which was lowered from 7.55% to 7%. We found that to be extremely appropriate and necessary for the plan. Price inflation, wage inflation, and payroll growth rate all stayed unchanged as an experience study.
Okay, I think one of the most significant assumptions that, and the largest change in the experience study was a change in the assumed rate of return. That was the decrease from 7.75 to 7. And we've done our own analysis on it and compared it to that recommendation. And we used a different process than CAPMAC, but in similar some ways. I don't know if the term skinning cats is, different way to skin a cat is appropriate in the last few months, what we hear, but I'm gonna use that term. And that, the way the CAPMAC looked at it is they gathered an assumption, they used an assumption set that was based on 20 or so investment consultants. And that assumption set was combined into averages in terms of expected returns and volatilities, and they used that to map out an expected return. Our process was we looked at each of those and we grabbed a similar but smaller assumption set that we have available from 7 investment consulting firms. We mapped PERS investment policy to each one of those assumption sets to find out based on their individual assumptions, what are the expected returns? And then we took an average of that. So and at the end of the day, you come out to a similar type order. But what this does is it really shows, especially for those who are numerically oriented, the variances in return expectations for investment consultants within the same year. And then we also compared 2021 and 2022 to see how much their expectations change from one year to another in those particular years. And then again, to further break things down, we know that from information that some investment consultants, while they call them long-term expectations, they're really only 7 to 10 years, while others are 20 to 30 years, and there's a few firms in there that actually provide both. And so it's important to recognize those differences, so we break them out separate. And so the headline and the conclusion is, we believe that the recommended decrease from 7.75 to 7 was appropriate. It certainly isn't an overreaction. And it can shows you're still about the 50th percentile, or you're just slightly below the probability of exceeding 7% over the long term. 20 to 30 years is just slightly below 50%. In our analysis, we based it on the information as 2021 and 2022 because that's at the time of the experience study report. And it may not be fair or just to include information known after that time. So it's really on an apples to apples basis. Since that time, as we can speak to it, capital market assumptions for 2023 and 2024 haven't decreased as much. They've kindly gone up a bit, normally because of short-term interest rates driven by the Fed, driving up interest rates beginning in March of 2022. Now they're on that backside. They're starting to look at pulling back and what part, how far will they pull back and how quickly. And so again, I think this is just an independent assessment of just saying, I think 7% was, moving that was the right decision by the PERS board.
All right, so in addition to reviewing the data, the assumptions, the methods used in the valuation, we did do a full replication of the results that CAVMAC came up with their valuation. And starting at the top here, we have a comparison of the key valuation results. So CAVMAC on the left and GRS on the right. So at the top line, the actuarial accrued liability, you can see we came very close, only a 0.3% difference, which is extremely close for the liabilities in total. Matched the actuarial value of assets, and then had a slight difference in the unfunded actuarial accrued liability, which is the liabilities less the assets. The funded ratio, or the ratio of the assets to liability, CAVMAC has a 55.9% funded ratio as of June 30th, 2024, and GRS independently calculated a 55.7% funding ratio. So again, very close. Looking at the bottom of this slide, we have the fixed rate contribution calculation. So you can see that net employer fixed contribution rate is the ultimate phased-in rate of 19.9%. But looking at the components at the top, the normal cost, the admin expenses, and the amortization of the unfunded liability, you can see GRS matched CAVMAC's results pretty closely there as well. And now looking at the actuarially determined contribution, we have the same components, the normal cost, the admin expenses, and the amortization of the unfunded liability. However, this is based on the system's funding policy. So we have an amortization period of about 24 years total. And if you look at the actuarially determined contribution, CAVMAC calculated a 25.92% contribution, and GRS calculated a 25.94% contribution. So again, only off there by 0.02%. So very minimal difference. So overall, we were able to closely match all of the valuation results that were calculated by CAVMAC, and we concluded that the calculations of the actuarially determined contribution and the liabilities were both reasonable.
And I just want to give one other emphasis on this, that the funding policy that the PERS board used, I think, is appropriate and very reasonable. The use of, the move to a layered amortization base with closed layered amortizations and the period, the ultimate, the period for starting and walking them down, I think are all very prudent. So it's going on record saying that, by no means is the PERS funding policy in any way could be stated anyway as being requiring more in contributions than what we think is necessary or appropriate. So, given the financial condition you're in.
Okay, so in addition to the valuation results, we also prepared our own 30-year projections. So here we have our projection at the top and then CAVMAC's projection on the bottom. You can see that, they are fairly close. However, there are slight differences due to different nuances that are used in projections, some additional assumptions, things like timing of different payments or contributions that can result in slight differences, especially when we get out to that 30-year period. The further out that we go, those differences can widen. But again, looking at 2047, GRS calculated, the ADC in 2047 would be 51.95% compared to CAVMAC's ADC of 51.92%. So still extremely close, even all the way out in 2047. So overall, we did come to the same conclusion. The system needs additional contributions to be sustainable.
Right.
All right, and just a couple minor suggestions for CAVMAC to consider. As Danny said before, this was an extremely clean audit. We did not have any very significant findings, but just a couple minor things. Using a different time period for different assumptions to make sure that, we're not overreacting to possible things that could really just be short-term trends. Using a different salary weighted approach for a few of the assumptions that can help to minimize gains and losses from year to year in the experience. And of course, continue to monitor the appropriateness of the 7% investment return assumption. As we've touched on, the assumption is extremely important, and continue to monitor that as needed. And finally, just a little bit more disclosure in the actuarial assumptions and methods section of the report. But again, nothing major, just some minor findings.
Absolutely, and this is a part I would, on this side of the, of the audience over here, take that as these are suggestions for possible improvement in the processes for the consulting actuary to consider. These are, you come in with an audit, and oftentimes we feel compelled that we've got to provide some suggestions or though to the process, and that's what these are meant to. Of these, the one that actually stands out the most to me, as I mentioned before, the 7% is appropriate. It's appropriate at this time. But as you know, years ago, the 7.75 was appropriate and no longer became that, and it had to be adjusted. It could happen again in a low interest rate environment, if that's what we're to return to, that the 7 may have to be adjusted downward again. So just keep that in mind, that these assumptions are not meant to be static forever, and adjustments from time to time may be necessary.
Since you mentioned it, what role do historic returns play in us evaluating the assumed rate of return going in the future? I've asked the question before, but I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about historical returns and what impact at all it should have in our consideration of future returns.
Yeah, it's a valid question that we hear a lot. I think from our standpoint as a firm, and even that as a policy, and it's in the standards of practice, there's very little, in terms of economic assumptions in particular, there's little weight given to historical actual experience. More so for demographic assumptions when you're setting retirement rates, turnover rates. Think of even inflation, and if you pair that to any economic assumptions, that we're looking more forward looking. And a lot of it's driven by interest rate environment. Which trend are you moving to? You saw in the 80s going from high interest rates to low interest rates. While that really grossed up returns during that period, it made things tough going forward to try to earn that. Here we are now, that we're in a more normal interest rate environment. And again, I think it's soon to be seen what happens going forward, are we going to return to more historical norms in investment returns? But in others, and I think I'll give I think through your question, I'll give a great example. You just look at fixed income alone, fixed income bonds alone. When you buy a bond, you know what you're going to get if you hold it to maturity. There will be some upside if there's a change in interest rate or the price, but then when you sell it and you're replacing it with a higher cost security. So in that regard, when you've seen historical returns and on fixed income in particular, well, what have overall interest rates done to help drive that return? And if it's moving in an upward interest rate environment, you've seen where you have had headwinds on those returns where it's very different than what's happened historically. And I think the fixed income environment's the most transparent, but I think some of that could be applied universally to various asset classes, but less directly so.
Following up on that, the issue that I have with that is actuaries by practice are conservative. And if over time you have been too conservative and those returns that we're having have demonstrated for years and years and years, your projections are just too conservative. So as a board member, I'm trying to weigh that conservatism versus what is actually proven to happen. And you just said that, well, you don't give much to the weights of what it did in the past, just please accept my conservatism going forward. Now, that's what I heard. Now, I can't hear very well, so I may have heard it wrong. So,
well, I'm going to respect your view,
okay.
and I'm not going to your opinion matters, and that maybe as I look at this PERS in particular, I don't know if I see that all that conservative isn't built in. you know, you look at the historical the demographic assumptions on the gain and losses. I don't, you know, they seem very well bounced out, pluses and minuses. Investment returns are much more uncertain. As I point back up to this slide here, 11, that expectations, even forward expectations, vary greatly from individual and individual. So you may say that you may be here at number 7 and may think I'm here at number 1, you know, in conservatism on expectations, but we don't know. And then the other thing I'll point to this, that I think it's important, and we don't consciously try to do it, maybe subconsciously, but there's a difference in risk. So there's greater risk to underperforming than if you you know, you return more than you assume.
Yeah, I understand that. There's always that risk. Now let's go to my favorite question from, for our consulting actuary. You mentioned normal inflation. What is the inflation rate today? Did you consider what it is today normal? Or do you consider what the Fed wants it to be normal?
Yeah, I believe that it's difficult to bet against the Fed. So the Fed has a target of 2%, and I believe that over time they're going to achieve their, and this goes into, we have a detailed report that outlines the various forward-looking metrics, but part of that goes in to understanding what the Fed's objectives are.
Well, this is another one of those things that I look at. The average inflation rate over the last 60 years has been over 3%. Fed wants to go to 2. Well, they got a 60-year history of being wrong.
I don't know if they've always wanted to be at 2 during that 60-year period.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
I don't know what their target was during that entire period, but
I don't
your
know.
facts are exactly right, though.
I don't know either, but if it's 60 years too conservative and we're still wanting to push it down rather than being closer to the norm, that's a question I always have for an actuary. Why isn't it closer to the norm? It's been above the 2% now for, I don't know how many years.
3-4 years? 3 years?
About 3.5 years,
Yeah.
I'd guess. And significantly so. Now, granted, it's been creeping back down, but it jumped back up a little bit. And so, and I don't want to overreact, but I don't want to price that inflation rate more than what it's going to be. So, anyway, that's always my question of our
Fair
consulting
comments.
actuary is why aren't we more closely monitoring the real rather than what the Fed wants it to be?
Absolutely fair. And I will give one other, hopefully this provides some other insight on both the economic assumptions of return, inflation. We are looking at projections over 30 years. And so we're trying to think through over a long period and forecast a very long time period. You think of different actuaries or of different environments, you know, you deal with healthcare. And for their, you know, they're looking at a time period of the next 18, 24, 36 months. And for those, they may have very different expectations on inflation and you know, other nuances and what impact the legislation. We're trying to model a much longer, significantly longer time period. And it may be very different in the short term. So
Our investment consultants give us that shorter term and actuaries give us a longer term, and I wrestle with that as well, and they move their interest rate or the inflation rate up some, and you know, and our return estimate up some, but 30 years our actuaries doesn't track that. It's always behind the curve on that, as I perceive it.
It'd be, I think part of that too is a notion of not to overreact. You know, when you do make a change, you don't, it would be very challenging for budget reasons and others if for every time there's an experience study and a review of the assumptions to make dramatic changes.
So I won't overreact to our consulting actuary. How many years, if it's above 2%, do we need to then move ours up? Ours is 2.65, I believe, or something like that right now. And it's over 4 right now, I think. So how many years does it need to be over that before we start pumping it, pushing it back up? Not 30 years, I hope.
No.
We got 60 years that says it's over 3%, so.
I think it's important to look at the trajectory.
Okay.
You know, things are, you look at CPI, if that's what you believe is your appropriate measure for inflation, where's it trending? And you see it trending down. You know, this last hurdle of this last 1% of going from 3 to 2 may be the hardest and the longest to get, but it may not be a pure line, straight line trending down, but it's trending that way. And I think as long as you see that trend line occurring, that would be my opinion.
Well, I thank you for your answers. I look at the numbers and part of the reason that the legislature wanted us to do this was to validate our consulting actuary and the numbers that he had. And to expand on that a little bit, I felt it was only fair for me to ask the same questions that I asked of him to validate and establish your thought processes as compared to the thought processes he has as he explains them to us as well. So sometimes I play the devil's advocate sitting over here.
And for the record, I did not watch those prior board meetings of what those responses were.
Mr. Chairman, I want to follow up with the last 2 questions. You had no control over the time element and the window of time in which you were given this assignment. And evidently there was some overlapping in the firms that were given this time element. I've looked over these reports and there's a lot of similarity in your findings. Just how independent is all 3 of these firms in evaluating what your assignment has been given?
I believe they're independent in the sense that we've not had conversations or minimal, the conversations were only limited to questions of possible discrepancy. And that really didn't occur much for this Val. As part of our prep, because of the timing you noted, we actually in our process went and replicated the 2023 valuation to that report. So we actually did a lot more, we did a lot more work and prep to have geared up because of the timing and the work that to turn around this project with the requested time frame. But it was independent in the sense that the calculations were done, independent. I think there's some dependence or some similarities in that we use the same valuation program to calculate both. So there's that similarity between the two outcomes, but that's not unusual, to use the similar outcomes or similar valuation system. Beyond that, a VAL system only goes as far as producing outputs of liabilities and projected benefit payments. From that, it goes into the financing part of calculating contribution rates, funding periods. So that is completely independent. When we look at the projections and the differences, I will say that great example there's additional nuances that are put in. That's where you'll see the greatest differences. We had the greatest, I would say that's the most independence on how our differences and how these are calculated, in nuances I think, there was no discussion between, how did you calculate these projections versus how we did, how we calculated ours.
The conclusion of all of you all, at which I wish there'd been some disagreement, that we got to come up with a bunch more money. I wish somebody would have said, oh, you don't need any more money. Thank you for your report.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
so let me make sure I understand too, because I know the 7% has lately been a big deal, and it is. Remind me, Mr. Higgins, the rate at which, the assumed rate, what it was at when the 22.4 was decided by the board to be implemented.
Let's see, the 22.4, so, and staff and Ed and Matt, correct me if I'm wrong as I recall, but the 22.4, I believe, was based on the 7.55% recommendation.
Just so the board,
Um,
just to reiterate that, and so that that is ruminated upon. And Mr. Dale, I think GRS can correct me if wrong, but GRS, they said this in a report, but I would say, I don't know if I'd use the word independent, but their build-up, bottom-up build-up of the whole thing is probably more so what you're asking about than what Chiron did, which is kind of looking at numbers that they already had generated and kind of doing validation of it, whereas GRS basically built those numbers up from scratch and then compared them. So this firm did what I would say is much more work from the ground up and came up with the same numbers, which I appreciate personally. So thank you.
I think that's an accurate statement too.
Any other questions?
I've got a few thoughts and questions at the right time, but I don't want to.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I need to speak in general terms because I'm not going to give investment advice to anybody. But I need to start out with what was the scope of work that you took on? Was it to grade CAVMAC's homework, or was it to give an analysis independent about an increase that has been recommended to the legislature? Because I don't see, and if I'm confused, Mr. Higgins, correct me, but the statute says the actuaries shall analyze the economic impact of any such recommendation. So clearly your recommendation is in line with other recommendations of significant more employer contribution. Nobody has suggested raising the employee contribution, just so you know. It's all been employer, which is state, local government, school districts, cities, counties, to an amount that is 11 to 12% more than what they have paid for the last several years. Where is the part that says the fiscal impact to every agency and arm of the state, including state agencies, cities, counties, and school districts? Because if we're all using the same assumptions, we can all use the same calculator, we're all going to get the same number. But nobody has talked about what that means to a state agency, a city or county government. And some of the discussions this board has had is if you raise that rate, let's just say we take your advice and the advice of others, and we just go in this session and say, let's go to 28%, 29%. Where's the analysis of what that does to employers not hiring PERS employees anymore? I think we're missing the point if all we're going to do is rehash the same numbers.
Mr. Higgins, you want to take that or you want me to?
Feel free, I can definitely speak to that in a variety of ways, and you feel free to do so, and if you want to hear from the actuaries, you can. To the specific part about the economic impact, you're exactly right, that's in the law. That's one of the main reasons why this is put forward as draft reports and preliminary results, just in the effort to get the main results ready prior to that. But that's one of the main reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that the reports aren't being asked to be officially accepted today is to go back and include that. And to include that part. And part of the reason is just time constraints on getting to the ADEC by each firm. But then we also need to kind of decide, either staff or board or otherwise, what to tell them to do. Like, for example, should each one do that when they, because what they're going to have to do, as you've alluded to, is calculate the difference impact between what's recommended or the ADEC and what the current contribution is. So will that be from 17.9 or will that be from 19.9? Do they all use their own individual ADEC or do we use the one from CAVMAC or whatever the case may be? The big picture will be the same, but that's just one of those details as to why that's not left out. So that's a long way of saying, great question, will certainly be included as part of the scope of work, and as the reports are finalized one way or the other, that'll all be included and provided.
Because that's the part, we talk about operating in reality. That's the reality, because you create a death spiral at some point. You can come in here and say, my calculator says 38% is the number, 56% is the number. But at some point, this man has to appropriate what limited amount of money the state has. And I feel like we're a little ahead of where we need to be if we don't have that part. So, because this would be the easier part, because it sounds like everybody's using the same assumption. And again, when you repeatedly mention CAVMAC and you say that we believe that number's good, we believe that number's good, well, of course the numbers are going to be close. And, the thing from the investment side is, whether it's the conservative approach or not, when you lower the expected rate of return from 8 to 7.75 to 7.55 to 7, that will drive up unfunded liability, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it'll make the investment team's job easier to hit the benchmark.
If the benchmark is the return assumption, then yeah.
Well, I would consider we can break every piece of fixed income or large cap, small cap, but at the end of the day, if 7 is our target, that's the benchmark that I'm most concerned with. And, I asked that question yesterday because some were up, some are down. But from what you said, the fixed income piece, your concerns, if I understood you correctly, in a lowering interest rate environment, that could have a negative impact on us reaching 7. Because when you were talking about investment return expectations on slide 11, you're talking about 7%, right?
Yes, sir.
So you're talking about the aggregate rate of return.
For the portfolio.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
And go ahead.
No, well, I'm just saying, in fiscal year 21, we had a 32.71% return in a historically low interest rate environment. So when the question comes about historical trends, and I'm not being critical, because if your scope of work's limited, I understand that you can only do what's in the scope of work. But this board has to make decisions going forward, and then the legislature has to make decisions going forward to try to do what everybody wants to do, is make sure that PERS is sound, solid, and reliable. But, we don't know. With a 32.71% return in a low interest rate environment, how does that dovetail into the factoring of lowering interest rate environments you believe gives a lower future target?
You point out the 1 year is you're referring to 2021.
That fiscal year 24. I'm just,
Yeah.
yes,
Well, if you look at the following year, fiscal year 2022,
it was bad.
it was bad.
Yes.
And so you look at the 2 years together, they're about to what your return expectation is. And I think that's one reason not to pull out a particular one year.
Yeah, and I don't want to do that because may not know this, but unfortunately, I think a lot of people, including myself, took a snapshot and didn't realize how dangerous that was their first year in the legislature. So,
Fair enough, yeah.
but I am very interested in the remaining part, and that would be true to the other actuaries, that the remaining part of this is the hardest part.
Yeah. As Mr. Higgins noted, our task is not complete. That there is that last task, and it was discussed with him prior to this meeting that this item still needs to be completed.
Thank you.
Few comments on a few of the things in other items too. As far as the independence and the scope of work, as far as to Commissioner Dale, your earlier question, I think they're very independent. I think they're about as independent as you could get. And on that, what I mean is they're separate firms, they're separate actuaries, they're, I guess you would say, friendly competitors for that matter. in the industry and in the business. Friendly around me anyway, but definitely, definitely competitors. And like I said, totally separate firms, totally separate actuaries. The reason there are similarities is because it's the same system and the same numbers and the same standards. And that's in my opinion is why there's similarities. So very, very independent. As far as the scope of work, as all of you know, as well as the senator and the legislative liaisons and others in legislative leadership, or at least their offices, all were put forward as an independent actuarial assessment, which is in reality is basically a concurrent actuarial audit, and they independently replicated the liabilities, determined their contributions, determined their actuarial determined contribution, the funded status, and all those things they've gone over. So, to my understanding and knowledge about is independent as could be with the scope of work and the approach that you all are familiar with. And we do need to get the economic impact by each employer, which we will calculate. That's certainly part of it. And on that, I can tell you roughly what it's going to be, though. It's going, at least in my estimation, and it's going to be the difference between 25.9 roughly percent of payroll and then 19.9% of payroll. But we'll get to that at a later time, and certainly it'll be included in the report. I have a few other things, but I want to pause in case there are other questions as a legislature or the committee. Anything else? Just for background, the inflation assumption is 2.4%. And I think in the GRS report, there's not the presentation necessarily, but the report, I think, one of the independent ones, there's a page on different inflation-related assumptions from different, like the Federal Reserve, different Federal Reserve banks, the Social Security Administration. Just want to call your attention to that. Also on the 7%, and I think Danny mentioned it too, I wouldn't necessarily call that conservative. You've heard me use the word appropriate. But you may remember some of the NASRA information from memory. I want to say the median is 7 and the average is 6.9 something, so we'd technically be above average if my memory is correct. And then also, as I think the way I interpret their slides they had a few minutes ago with the various investment consultants, if you look down at the bottom, short-term and long-term, on average, they were below what we had at 7%. And if I'm incorrect in interpreting that, let me know, but I think that's what it's showing at the bottom. So I wouldn't necessarily call it conservative. And then one thing that may help, very good questions about historical experience, and I'm gonna put it in a one or two liner. Maybe it is that demographic assumptions, you look more toward historical experience. Economic assumptions, you look more forward. And I think maybe it'd be true to emphasize that's because a lot of that's based on forward-looking capital market assumptions. Is that
Absolutely.
correct? So, let's see. Two other quick things. On the replication side, and let me, you pulled up the inflation chart when I was talking. If anybody would like to look at that, anybody want to look at that right quick? There it is. And I can't quite see, but it's a different, it's more than just ours, of course. They've analyzed several different types of inflation forward-looking forecasts that's in the draft report. I guess unless you all have questions, if you go back to the replication slide right quick. And I definitely don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want to ask this. You know, you mentioned that the results are very close, and of course they are very close. But definitely not trying to put words in your mouth, but while you all are here, would it be true to say that those results being so close, that's something along the lines of exceptional, really good, phenomenal, or whatever? And I say that in the context of, say, work you know in the private sector or what the IRS might consider, because that's come up before. And I think one of the previous auditors put in context that was really good results, but could you speak to that a little bit?
I would put it as more in the exceptional, given, and I say that with the following caveats, that note we use the same valuation system, which, you know, as they did, it's ProVal. It's a purchase licensing program. So that's going to bring you very, very close. You got the same assumptions, the same inputs, but are you using those same inputs similarly? You know, in terms of timing, or you can get differences as somebody leaving at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year. You know, or you know, you got various switches, turn on eligibility. You know, when are you eligible for the retirement benefit? Is that at the beginning of the year? Maybe it's through the year or end of year. There's a lot of switches and nuances that go in there. And the fact that we came this close without really having, we had very minimal discussion with the consulting actuary on this, that we had our results prepared, and their results for 2024 weren't known till last week. And so last week, we were still putting together these slides information, trying to fill in the blanks for the comparison part. So in that regard, that's where I find that in the comfort. Now, we probably wouldn't have been that close had we not tried to also replicate the 2023 val. So what's not in here is we independently compared the results of the 2023 val. You might say there was a little bit of synchronizing our watches there in that process to make sure when we get things, because the timeline was so tight, to have really informative and provide value to this board today.
And then, thank you for that. The last thing, you touched on it a little bit, but when it comes to the various key methods, you've talked and verified that things are done in accordance with actuarial standards of practice and reasonable and appropriate and all those types of things. But on a few of the key methods that we use and that our actuary uses based on the approvals of the board, things like amortization method, actuarial smoothing, and a few other things like that, layered amortization. Would you comment on the fact of that and percent of payroll method? It's my understanding that all of those things and those methods are very common across the country, very common across other public pensions, but would you speak to that briefly?
Absolutely. The use of layered amortization is becoming more predominant in terms of determining an actuarial calculation method. Part of this goes to this bottom comment on the actual standards of practice is section 321. I'll let you go Google it and read about it later. But it goes to, it's a relatively new requirement, but it goes to, in our reports and in terms of boards, they have to establish a reasonable actuarial determined contribution. And there's a lot of parameters that go into saying, what is that? What is it that makes it reasonable? They look at funding periods, negative amortizations, or even covering the interest on your balance, your unfunded liability. Are you paying it down? And really, this goes to say that this is a strong movement away from this concept of 30-year open or 30-year funding period. Every year, you calculate a 30-year funding period as your benchmark. That's it's not even a bronze standard anymore. So you're moving, to something much that it really does, at the end of the day, is expected. If these contribution rates are paid, you will, start moving towards 100% funded status, which is the goal.
Thank you. That's all I had. Thank you.
Well, then, based on that comment, I guess I go back to the assumptions you arrived. Is that because that's the standard in the actuarial world, or is it happenstance that you chose 7, or did you choose 7 because that's what the plan has said is our rate of return?
Our scope was to assess the reasonableness of 7. It wasn't to say, what would Woody come in and say, what do we recommend the assumption be? Is the 7% appropriate?
And is that because that's what the plan currently is adopted by the board?
Yes.
That's
it.
Because when we're talking about
exactly
conservative,
right.
if you thought 6.9 is the right number, you would have plugged 6.9, but you just simply judged whether you thought 7 was appropriate.
Yes, by the standards of practice, yeah.
All right. Then on the amortization schedule, did you choose layered amortization, or did you look at what the plan says should be amortization, and did you say that the plan adopted by the board is within our guidelines and standards and practices?
It's what's adopted by the board.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there has been no analysis of what you think it should be, just that what it is acceptable.
I'm going to comment when you're finished, or if you want me to now.
Yeah, I do think it's in terms of, I don't think it's appropriate for an audit actuary to come in and just make a blanket blanche recommendation about what a funding policy should be without having without first consulting with the board or, with stakeholders about, how, you're moving beyond actuarial calculations and you're moving into policy decisions. And for that, it's not, I think it would be inappropriate for any independent consultant to come in and just start making recommended policy decisions without really having without understanding.
And that's
That-
fair.
yeah.
I need to understand the scope,
Absolutely.
because if your scope is to come in and judge what is the policy and whether you think that's within reasonableness,
Yes,
then that's a good response, is that it appears everything's within reasonableness. But it goes back to the ultimate question of, you referred to layered amortization and how you deal with negative amortization, and if you have that. And the way I understood it yesterday is, we take what the actuarial determined liability is before we change the policy to a 25-year period, and you figured that at 30 years, and now every year that goes by, it's a lesser year, just like my mortgage, if I pay interest only or less than interest, and that all made sense to me. Then if I have negative cash flow each year, that's as if I went and borrowed more money, and we factor that because it becomes part of the unfunded liability, correct? If I have negative cash flow.
I would put in, it's a little more, it's similar, but I'm not going to, at a high level, you have the concept, but in details, the devil in the details, it's slightly different. In your example, to say where it's different and probably clarify, you talk about your mortgage. And let's say on your mortgage, to pay down principal, you need to be paying $2,000 a month, but you're only paying $1,500 a month. You're not actually paying down the outstanding balance of mortgage, it's going up. That's your negative.
That's correct.
Negative amortization or that. So at some point you have to increase it. Where the layered amortization goes into is you have, let's say you have, and I'll use 2022 as the example of you change assumptions. So you have your original balance, you're paying down, then you change assumptions, you add 3 billion or so because you go from 775 to 7. It's like buying your wife a car. You've got a new expense that you got to finance and pay down, and so you have a new amortization. You're paying your home mortgage, and now you're also paying a car payment.
So that new car payment, though, is factored at a shorter amortization period.
Yes.
All right. And you said that's required. I think I understood you say that's required. Is that required?
I think to follow the policy or the standards of practice, yes. It's the part where we're doing an education session now, but I'll give you an example of something that's unreasonable. You have your 30-year mortgage, and you're making your scheduled payment on it, or your $1,500, whatever. You buy your wife a car. You say, hey, I want to roll that into my mortgage payment, and oh, by the way, I want to refinance it 30 years.
And I think that's how we operated the debt here for a period of years. Am I correct?
And that's the move away from. That's not, we're moving to a stronger policy.
If I understood one aspect there, open amortization would be basically refinancing it each year, I think is what you were getting at the end, last comment. Which we have moved away to. That's one of those more conservative approaches over the last few years, moving toward the closed amortization. Couple of comments on scope and some of the earlier part of that last exchange. Great question, great point. Definitely appreciate that. What I would say is they used the 7% and the amortization method and things like that has been adopted by the board, unless it's in statute, to do the calculations, because that's what exists. But it's very much part of their scope. In my opinion, I think they would agree to review the reasonableness and the appropriateness of the assumptions being used, and making sure we're doing things consistent with actuarial standards of practice. And I think they've said and written that they believe that the assumptions are appropriate or reasonable. And then by all means, should you, and I know I appreciate your comments on doing it the proper way, I guess, an audit, actuarial audit. But definitely part of the scope, I think they've said and written about them being reasonable and appropriate. And I would say again, if for some reason there's something you think that we as a system have not used or are not using that's reasonable and appropriate, by all means, suggest it, and we'll get that to the board. But I think they've confirmed that it's reasonable.
And had we left it at 755, would you have deemed that to be reasonable and appropriate when you came?
Great question. Say that again.
No.
So 8% wouldn't be either?
Only kidding. Probably not. If 775 is a no, well, I'd say 8% it would not be
Well,
reasonable.
what about now? He said, did you say 775?
I said 755.
755. So
7.55.
Had our policy remained at 755 and you had come to do this same thing, would this report have said, is that reasonable?
No.
And the policy, I think, was at 775 to use an overage to buy the rate down if we hit a certain level. Is that still the policy of the board?
It was changed.
Yeah, but we did buy it down to 755, so in effect, it went to 755 and then from 755 to 7.
Right, but 755 wasn't bought down, it was
Yeah.
turned down.
No,
Yeah.
it was just, it was a
Direct.
direct.
32% year. Yeah.
It was just moved to it. All right. That's all I have for this particular segment, unless you all have anything else.
Anybody with anything else? Again, thank you all for the presentation. Thank you for the work. We'll be seeing more of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Between now and November, I say.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good job. You want to move straight forward to CABMAC?
Unless anybody need a minute or two?
Yeah, cause we're gonna go to 11:30
Okay.
or 11:40, no.
Or longer.
We're
We're
gonna
gonna go a long time.
12:30. We're gonna go to 12:30.
All right, let's do, as Chairman said, we'll take the 5 minute, to try not to be more than 10.
All right, good deal. We're going to take a little break to make sure, mute, pause. All right.
How are you this morning?
Hey.
We'll go back into administrative committee and turn it over to Mr. Higgins and Capmac.
Yep, we'll go straight to CABMAC.
All right, so, third time's the charm, here in the same results. Hopefully, we've all, got this all memorized. But you've all seen our numbers already, so there's really, no suspense here. GRS killed our suspense. But, you know, as always, we're gonna go through a lot more detail, than you've heard from Chiron and from GRS, as we're the retained actuary. So we want to give you a lot more information, regarding, the results, the breakdown of membership, the contributions, and all the sensitivity that goes into our projections. Our job is to kind of bring, a risk profile to you and make you aware of those risks that go into investment contributions, mortality, all that stuff as well. So that's part of our report as well. So it's much more detailed. By now, you've already know the changes since last year, that the fixed contribution rate is really now a statutory contribution rate. That's phasing into 19.9% of payroll. I call it statutory because it is in statute due to a legislative bill. However, for all the purposes of going forward in this presentation and everything in your report, we've left everything called fixed contribution rate. Statutory contribution rate is not in the glossary of terms. It's not in the funding policy, but fixed contribution rate is. So, again, just clarity that is in, we will continue to call it fixed contribution rate for this purpose. And then the additional $110 million was contributed by the state. This is included, it was deposited into the bank account after the fiscal year. However, it was, deemed necessary to include in the valuation as a receivable because it was.
But there is no additional funds in there other than that 110.
Correct. That's correct. Yes. So the market return for the fiscal year end was 10.4%. We're going to dig into that. Last year was 7.4. We assume mid-year cash flow, so this might be slightly different than what PERS staff and the media relate to. This is a net amount as well, net of investment expenses. So 10.4 is what we get, assuming mid-year cash flow. We assume all cash flow occurs as of January 1st throughout the year. So we come up with that estimated amount. On an actual value basis, the return was 7.3%. Again, we're going to, due to the conversation yesterday, I got an extra slide in here today that might not be in your books that will go through the explanation of that. Our funded ratio went from 56.1% to 55.9%, so not real much movement there, but a little bit downward. The amortization period using the phased-in amount of 19.9 is 44.9 years. I think, GRS had it at 45. If you technically want to look at it, it's 44.9. Last year, we were 32.2 years. So the big increase, again, was we were assuming last year's fixed contribution rate phasing up to 22.4, as was the board approved increase into the FCR. So a less of a more amortization period. So when you're putting in more money, when you're assumed to put in more money, you could pay that over a shorter period of time. Our actually determined contribution, again, as GRS pointed out, was 25.92. And when we look at the metric ADC over FCR, we get that as 130.3%. So that means that amount, 25.92, is 30% higher than the FCR of 19.9. And if we show you the projections, the short-term projection of numbers on the unfunded actuarial accrued liability, or UAAL, you can see that's growing from RVAL of $26.5 billion up to $29.1 billion in the next 5 years. Again, we talked a little bit about that yesterday during our Actuarial 101 session about how we're anticipating that to grow over the next few years. The funded ratio pretty much stays flat over this short-term period. Our cash flow does get worse on a negative piece. We'll show you that in a graph form. And the ratio does get worse as well. When we project out, based on the funding policy out to 2047, that funded ratio doesn't change much. We're at 53.7%, which is in the red status based on the metrics. The cash flow is negative 6.3%, which is in the yellow status. And again, our ADEC to FCR ratio is in the red status. All right, getting into the valuation results first. So we do a snapshot valuation as of June 30th each year. This is just kind of a look back of the last 7 years of historical active members and retiree members. Basically, the active members was flat almost this year, just down about 150 people. I consider that flat. If you recall, we've been decreasing for quite a while, a number of years until last year when we had our first increase in about 15 years. The retirees, though, continue to grow. We had about 900 more retirees that were processed in this last fiscal year than the previous fiscal year. So you're going to see a little bit of a retirement loss when we get to the actuarial gain loss slide, because we had more retirements than we were expecting occur during the year. So you see that number went up about 2,500. That means there are net 2,500 more retirements than deaths. So again, we'll dig into that a little bit. Payroll is about $7.2 billion when we look at just those active members. I think you've seen some higher numbers in some other charts. Those are kind of the fiscal year expectations going forward. But as of 2024, June 30th, the payroll was about $7.2 billion. And then the actual benefit payments was about $3.5 billion going out to retirees. We always show this chart. This is a 10-year history of the assets on a market value basis and an actuarial value basis. The good thing here, the trend line is going up. That's good. We want to see that. I'd like the slope to be a little bit higher. But with our negative cash flow, when we get return years like 10.4%, we're not growing the assets at 10.4%. It takes out that cash flow. But our market value did grow to $33.45 billion, and our actuarial value is almost right on top of that, $33.5 billion as of June 30th of 2024. You could see why we use a smooth value, an actual smooth value, because we avoid the volatility that occurs in the market like we saw in 21 and 22. This is my new slide. I just added this last night. And this is based on the conversation we had yesterday about how do we calculate what the actuarial value return is. And we were coming up with a value of 7.3%. And it isn't simply just taking the average of the market value returns over the last 5 years. And Chiron did a decent job of explaining that, but I thought maybe seeing the numbers would kind of help you all out with this. So I'm going to take each line by line. I'll spend a little time on this. So 2020, the market return, the net market return was 3.1%. However, during that valuation, we were actually assuming 7.75%. So there was a loss, and the corresponding market loss in dollars was about $1.3 billion. Right? So we assumed that the market would grow a certain amount, and it still did. It was a positive return for the year, but it didn't meet our expectations of how much growth we expected in dollar form. So we take 20% of that, and we get $256 million that we're going to recognize over into our actual value of assets over the next 5 years. That's what we're talking about when we say we smooth the gains and losses over a 5-year period. It's a dollar amount, not a return. It's a dollar amount. So then 2021, we had the great year, 32% return. Again, we were assuming 7.75, and we got a $6.6 billion gain in our investment return above what we expected. But we recognized 20% of that, so $1.3 billion. Now, I'm going to pause here because what did we do with that gain, right? We talked a little bit about this morning is the PERS board had the policy in place to decrease the discount rate or the investment return assumption by a certain amount based on our returns. So we reduced the investment return by 20%, and we were saying we're going to use some of those gains to offset that, right? So we used that $6.6 billion to help offset the increase in liability that we were going to see by decreasing the investment return down to 7.55. So that was key, because we made sure we had that in the policy to do that. Unfortunately, what happened the next year? We had a terrible investment year, a negative 8.6%. We assume we're 7.55. We had to drop that assumption. But the corresponding market value of assets return was negative $5.6 billion. So like GRS said this morning, it almost ate all of that great gain that we had used to drop the discount rate. We lost almost all of it in that 1 year. So that really hurt PERS, that 1 year. And since then, we've had a pretty decent return, 7.4 and 10.4 returns. And those have, well, 7.4, we were assuming 7.55, so it was actually a loss, small little loss, but it was a loss. And then this year, we had a gain of $1 billion more on investment rates of return. So when we add up that column that says 20% of experience for 5 years, that adds up to about $156 million. That's how much we're recognizing as above our expected investment return for the year. So that's not a lot of money. So that's why when we correspond that back to and do our calculations of mid-year calculations, we get a return of just above 7%. It's a gain. We're recognizing it's a positive number. We have more gains than losses in dollar form. So that's why it's 7.3%, and not just an average of the net market returns, which I believe Senator Sparks, you got about 8.9% if you average the second column there on the left. So it gets down in the weeds of how we do this calculation. But it's not just a simple taking the average of the returns. Now, I put in a hypothetical, what if we got 7% this fiscal year that we're in? So next year, if we get 7% and we assume 7%, then we got 0 corresponding dollars above what we expected. So we value 20% of that, obviously, is 0. So what next year's would look like is we're dropping out the $256 million loss next year, and we're adding a 0 in there. So our net gain that we'd be recognized is $413 million. Now that's a little bit more, that's a better expectation, right, than 7%. And that's why that actuarial value rate of return would be 8.2%. So again, you can look into the back of our report in the assets section. There are 3 slides or 3 pages in our report that go through these exact calculations themselves, okay? But just kind of wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining that.
If I may, I do want to
Yes,
ask one question,
please.
because that's why I asked the question.
Yes.
I 100% agree with you. It's a weighted return, because whatever my principle is, my return has to go back to correlate. But that's my concern, is if you extrapolated this out to 2026 hypothetical, that 8.2 number, if you assumed a 0 for 25 and 26, is going to fall below the anticipated rate of return. And if the good Lord calls me home before that, I want everybody to look over here at this empty seat and say, we know we didn't lose a bunch of money,
Right,
even though the actuarial number will show that we're below 7%.
Right. It will be. You're exactly right. And you'll see that in our projection chart. You're going to see a little dip in the funded ratio line. And you probably even saw it in this slide up here on our short-term projection. Right? You see there between 25 and 26, the funded ratio goes from 56.6 to 55.1. That's the drop that Senator Sparks is talking about in the funded ratio, because we're gonna have a loss that year. That actual value return hypothetically would be somewhere in the range of 4 to 5% because of this. So, we need more gains. Is Callan still here? We need more gains over the next few years to kind of help offset that. No.
Well, I think Mr. Nielsen's targeting 37%. With a relative degree of risk, that's appropriate. So
All right,
we're not
so,
targeting 7, I don't think.
so that was my continuation of my actuarial 101 from yesterday. I'll get back to the regular scheduled program here. So our liability, total present value of future benefits that we went through yesterday is $65.7 billion. And how are we funding for that? Because if we had an asset pool of $65.7 billion today, really, PERS wouldn't need another dime into it. We'd have enough to cover all of the active members and retired members today that were in the plan today. We wouldn't have the future, but that would just be normal cost contributions that would go in. So we wouldn't need another dime, but we don't have that, right? PERS has about $33.5 billion as of June 30th of 2024. And how are we getting the rest? Well, the rest, and it's about almost split in half, is coming from member contributions, normal cost employer contributions, that breakdown of the ADEC that we talked about yesterday. And then the rest has to come to pay down the unfunded actuarial accrued liabilities. And what we're saying by saying that our amortization is 45 years, that if everything was to remain status quo as of today, that the difference in the fixed contribution rate and the normal cost rate to pay down that $26.5 billion would take 45 years. So that's a long time, and that's well beyond what the funding policy objectives and metrics are saying, that we want to be 100% funded. So that's why we're saying that our recommendation is for more contributions into PERS. Here's a little bit of a historical look of 7 years of funded ratios, and we're hovering around that 61% until last year, when we dropped down to about 56 due to the drop in the discount rate down to 7%. Always my favorite chart is the actual gain loss analysis chart, as to say what happened during the year versus what we expected, right? We've already gone through, we had a little bit of an investment gain for the year of $88 million of what we expected. So that's good on an actual value basis. We did see another year of salary losses, meaning salaries increases were higher than what we expect. And in the back of your report, in the assumptions section, there's a table in there that has your expectation of what salaries will grow, both on an inflation basis, on a wage inflation basis, which is 2.65%. It's a little bit higher than our price inflation number. But we also have merit, seniority, promotions embedded as another component of salary increases to folks. So we assume on average across everybody, and everybody at different service levels gets different rates of salary increase, but on average, we assume that salaries will grow for individuals about 4.75%. Well, they grew just over 5%. In fact, it was 5.01% for the people who were in the VAL last year in 23 and are active still this year. Those payrolls grew on average over 5%. Well, that's a little bit more than what we expected. And what are we doing? We're trying to project out that benefits payment stream. That benefit payment stream is folks' benefits in the future. And when you give higher salary increases, it increases that projection of benefits, because that's what their final average pay is going to be based on. So each year you're going to see either a salary gain or a salary loss. And I kind of touched on this a little bit yesterday, is over the last 10 years, we've had 6 years of salary gains and 4 years of salary losses. Now, those salary losses have really come in the last 3 out of the 4, those 4 were in the last 3 out of 4 years. Right? And we've seen this across the country in the public sector arena, especially on teachers, is post-COVID, a lot of folks are getting those payroll growths that they didn't get for so many years in the past, right? So again, off my soapbox, but that's kind of what's been happening on the salary increase. Last year, that number was much higher
So as
loss.
the mortality table for the baby boomers begins to kick in, that gain number should grow.
Well, it's, we have a moving scale on the mortality, right? Again, we talked about this yesterday, the generational mortality of the next generation is going to live longer. So it's a moving scale for improvement in mortality for future benefits. So again, we're expecting, we have an expectation, it's kind of morbid, but we have an expectation of when each percentage of folks are going to die out of PERS. And so, yes, we do see a big, after 2036, 2038 is when the majority of those baby boomers we're expecting have gone on and passed. So, but we did see a gain, like you pointed out, this year. So there were more deaths than we actually anticipated. But I mean,
So that number is actually the excess of the anticipated, right?
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, all of these are on excess of what expected, either negative or positive.
This is a variance report.
Sorry?
This is a budget versus actual variance
Yep,
report,
yep,
basically,
Yeah,
for those of you
yeah,
who may deal
for
with
your
that.
accountants in the
Yeah.
room, yes, perfect analogy, yes. This is our, I always refer to staff, this is our checklist. You know, this is what we need to be able to explain what happens in the data. And this is why I say this is my favorite chart, because actuaries love data. We love digging into retirement behaviors and withdrawal. Why do people retire when they do? Why do they leave? We love to see all this stuff and see the numbers that go into this. And this is what GRS was talking about earlier with the experience study report and reviewing those assumptions. And that's why we do that with y'all every 2 years, is we want these numbers to be close to zero as possible. All right. So our fixed contribution rate, just to break down, our normal cost is 2.57% for this year. This is the 2024 line. It's slightly lower than last year. But with the 19.9, we're only leaving that 17.33% to be paid off towards the unfunded. And that's what I was referring to, would take 45 years to pay down the $26.5 million, $1 billion.
Have you moved on from 12 or whatever that variant schedule was?
Yeah, I can go back to it.
I was just curious, what's other?
Other is
You either did or
data. The majority of the other is data changes. So we collect data from PERS staff, which they get from all of the employers. And, you know, keeping track of 350,000 members' records, things change from year to year. And we've seen the gamut of, you know, we get data and all of a sudden that person wasn't born in 1992, they're born in 1962. And guess what? When you're born in 1962, you're 30 years older, your liability is a lot higher. So again, I'm not putting any blame on anybody. It just happens. There are typos. People type in wrong things when they send us the data. There are, you know, sometimes the folks get married, and now we're leaving them a joint and survivor benefit when we had assumed that they were single and we were going to leave them they were just receiving a single life annuity, you know, and now we're leaving a benefit to a spouse as well. So a lot of that, I think about 100 million of that is just due to data. The other is due to timing of things, the amortization, negative amortization we talked about yesterday. Is part of that. That's about $50 million of that number, and then there's some net other things going on there. So it's kind of what else is left, really. That's the kind of bucket.
On the data reconciliation part, would it be accurate to say that that's similar to what you see across other clients and other plans from year to year?
Oh, yeah, yes. That's the biggest struggle we have, and that's why we always say the data reconciliation analysis takes about half of the amount of time that we do in preparing evaluation for each of our clients. It's the data prep, because we're going through the data of, again, 350,000 records, and Darby in the back, you met her yesterday, she's in charge of all that and do that, and then she works with Mason and the staff here to ask those questions. You know, why did somebody's salaries go up 50%? Believe me, it happens. It's just something that, you know, something happened from last year to this year where we're seeing data improvements. It's getting better each year. Yes, sir.
Can I ask an FYI question? How many 100-year-old do we have on, 100+ we still have on retirement?
70-something. Anybody know the latest?
We had approximately 80
70?
at the end of 2023. I don't know now. All systems? They were about 80 people drawing benefits at the end of 2023.
I was on the radio one morning and made that statement. Paul Gallo, he couldn't, it just blew the whole show. He couldn't talk about anything after that. 80. He said 2. I said,
We're showing over 100.
Over 100.
We'll
Over 100?
Yeah, showing over 100. Over 100, over 100.
100
hey, George, that's looking good for us.
I'm shooting for that. That sounds like a good deal to me.
Yeah.
And those are actuarial losses. Right? We were not expecting that. All right. So we dove into our 101 session yesterday about the layered amortization. These are the numbers that really, not the buying of a house and winning the lottery, but these are the actual numbers for PERS that we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years. The 2018 is where we set that original unfunded of $16.9 billion. That's what the unfunded was just 6 years ago. And we're paying that over a 30-year period, and we talked about negative amortization. So the remaining balance is higher, but that amortization payment is growing by 2.65% each year. So what will happen is if the contribution was changed to an ADEC method, that you would make this contribution and the unfunded, all these pieces would be amortized over those periods. And there's about an average of, like GRS said, 24 years to go if contributions were paid over on an ADEC basis. So again, if we take the 23.35% and add that to the normal cost, we get the 25.92% that we developed there. I'll go into the projections a little bit, and then we'll get into our recommendations, and then we'll get into the sensitivity numbers as well. This is Dr. McCoy's favorite chart. You know, and I saw the other two actuarial firms put this together as well, so they got the memo that this was your chart and you wanted to see these numbers, so
It was ease of comparison.
exactly. So, you know, there are differences. I did note in both the Chiron and the GRS projections, there are differences. But I think what it boils down to is, you know, when we were going through the flow chart yesterday of present value of future benefits, and then you break that down into what's been accrued to date, actuarial accrued liability, and what's future normal cost. That is really a budgeting tool that actuaries use to kind of do those splits. And different actuarial firms will have a slightly different budgeting tool. So you may see more put into actuarial accrued liability and less into normal cost, or vice versa. So I think that's maybe a difference of what's going on here, because if you go back and look at GRS's number, they had a higher unfunded actuarial accrued liability, or higher liability, but a lower normal cost than us. So again, it's just a balancing of that. But I bet you if you look at our present value of future benefits in comparison, those are probably right on with expectations. Since they match the val so closely, I'm expecting that we were close in that aspect as well. But even though that was a difference on those second and third line, their ADEC contributions were almost right on. I think they said 51.7% in 2047, and we're getting 51.92. So even though there was a slight difference in the breakdown of those two buckets, the total ADEC was very comparable. So again, this is a table form of what you'll see in graph form on the next slide. But based on current baseline projections and current statutory contribution rates, we're expecting the funded ratio in 2047 to be just under 54%. And this is the graph you saw yesterday from me on our Tier 5 analysis. And again, Senator Sparks, you see that little blip there in that red line there for 2026, where we see the little drop in the funded ratio.
Quick question, could you go back one slide? Let me ask you something. On the ADC row, and how that grows, you were just mentioning, would it be true to say that part of the reason that in that projection continues to increase is because the current fixed contribution rate currently is not equal to the actuarial determined contribution rate? So because of that funding shortfall in that comparison is one of the reasons it's driving that to continue to grow. Is that correct?
Yeah, when we run the projections out and we have contributions coming in that are on an employer basis that are only 19.9%, but on an actuary will tell you on a closed amortization basis, we're needing more than that. You build in contribution losses into the breakdown of this. So not only, again, my favorite chart, our little checklist or audit checklist thing, you see contribution losses that are built into that unfunded as it builds up. So that's why that ADEC the unfunded is growing, not declining like we would expect. If you were paying the ADEC, if PERS goes to an ADEC basis, you'll see the unfunded grow, but by the time you get 24 years out, you unfunded would be zero. But it's all these contribution losses that are built up every year for the next 30 years. That's why you see that.
The contribution losses are in 2024, the 25.9, but then there's no other, there's no other built-in income in that. So that's what you're saying. The contribution losses are there. Well, I mean, we don't have them.
Right.
I say losses, but that's all we know.
That's what you're going to build up over the years is if the funding isn't changed or other things aren't changed.
Make sure that my interpretation is right. Okay.
That 25.92 though, that includes 17.9 and the 110 million?
The 110 million is in the base asset amount. So it is in the asset amount. When we calculate our unfunded actuarial accrued liability, it's in there.
And that was done in 24?
It was done right after 2024, but there's an actuarial in our standards of practice that says if we know of major events that have happened fiscally, demographically, we can recognize those even though those have occurred after the fiscal year.
Okay.
So we knew that was coming in, we knew it was scheduled, and
You just treat it as the receivable.
Melanie.
Well, I was going to say, as of
can give you
June
the
30th, it was a
receivable,
receivable, so therefore an asset.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
staff can give you the date, but since we knew it by the time we were doing the val, we valued it as a receivable.
Okay.
Let me ask this too, going back to this same subject really, but the ADC row. You know, a lot of times we share information or say something along the lines of, when it comes to the funding of PERS and the contributions, that the longer we wait, the harder it gets, or the longer we go, the more it may cost and so forth. Is that row an illustration of that?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I remind you, once we get the unfunded, or if we ever get the unfunded to zero, the contribution that would be required, or the ADEC, would just be the normal cost here, which is around 3% of pay. So if this plan were to ever get in our lifetime to 0% unfunded actuarial accrued liability. Just remember that the required contribution coming in wouldn't need to be 19.9 or 27.9 or whatever. It would just be the normal cost, right? And it would have fluctuations in it each year based on gains or losses, but, we would be, so if we were to, there are plans across the country that are 100% funded, and all they put in is the normal cost, the ongoing accruals as a cost.
The contribution loss that you're referencing is how you're calculating every year's UAAL, in the sense of, when I'm looking at the chart you were just looking at, I think on 13. So for 22 is $564 million. Is that considered the contribution loss when you're calculating your amortization?
On
Page 13, maybe.
13,
Uh,
14, this number?
14,
Yeah.
yes.
So, I guess I should have spent a little bit more time. So the $900 million, that's the loss for this year. So again, back to this page, it's the accumulation of this page plus any contribution losses.
Okay, so this
Right.
is variances from expectations plus
Right.
contribution losses. And the contribution loss, just to make sure I'm clear, is your contributions less what you paid out, irregardless of gains or losses. It's the true contribution loss.
It's what the actuary recommended be put into the system based on the funding policy of the plan versus what actually went in.
All right, because the $5.3 billion year is when we absorbed the move from 755 to 7. It's not a loss. It was a change in funding policy, which completely changed the numbers, correct?
No, the 5.3 billion actually wasn't that year. That was the change, or maybe you said that. There was a change in assumptions.
Yes, from 755
From
to 7.
7.55. That was only about 3.7 billion of that. There was another, I forget the numbers, but there was another $1 billion of demographic losses that happened last year's Val. So, it just wasn't the change from 7.55 to 7. Yes, that was the majority of it, but it wasn't the whole thing.
And the reason I ask that is because that's how you're calculating your amortization, and I'm learning, and thank you for your patience, but
No problem.
there's the math loss. There's the fact that contributions are not enough to pay out benefits. Therefore, there is a negative net cash position. Now, we may cover that with gains, but a portion of that is going to pay those benefits. Therefore, it's not going to be in your principal to earn your anticipated rate of return next year.
Right.
But in this situation, you're calculating not so much on the cash balance sheet, but on your assumptions changing, which could be anything from a policy change, which happened and was a large part of that, to a change in mortality, anything that was on the other list, including pay raises. And I would say that may be a significant pay raise year.
It was.
Okay.
Yes,
I
it
think,
was.
because I think we.
It was almost $1 billion loss in liability due to the payrolls. It was 900 and something million dollars, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And on the contribution loss or the contribution deficiency, or however it's phrased, would it be true to say that's basically comparing the roughly 25% ADEC versus the 17.4?
Yeah, it's a 6% difference or whatever it was, yeah. And that's anticipated to grow, as you see in this chart, is the ADEC grows, but the FCR is not growing. So it gets worse, and here's that chart. Here's that graphical form of what the ADEC could continue to grow with contribution losses.
Senator, one of the things that happen like that, when it changes, back when I was working, I called that funny money, trying to change. So that's one of the reasons that I tend to look at cash flow. Do we have the money to pay the benefits? And that kind of clears my mind and eliminates some of that other stuff that's going on in all these numbers.
Yes, and I agree, and I am learning. I'm not saying that as a pleasantry. I really am. But beneficiaries hear of dramatic losses that are funny money, that aren't real losses, but to the actuarial computations for the future, it's a real loss. And I just don't want to be flippant with the fact that we lost $5.5 billion. Well, we didn't. We changed the assumption,
yeah.
which, and then a lot of that's pay raises. That's counterintuitive again, is when we raise the pay of Mississippi employees, that's a negative hit to the retirement system, so.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot when we go through that, and especially we did last year, and I know staff always asks me, but the thing to remember, that when payroll increases are given, we're projecting that out, right, for the rest of the active employee's lifetime. But now they're starting on a much higher salary, and we're still projecting 4-point-something raises every year. But that hits the liability today, immediately. But where it helps in the back end, down the line in projections, is there's more contributions then coming in to help offset that. So the PERS gets hit right away. But the hope is, with higher salaries, the 9% and the 19.9 or whatever is the FCR at that time, more contributions will be coming. And I think that's why you see this graph here on the cash flow is we get worse, but then we get better. So that is helping in the long run. I mean, we're projecting out $14 billion of payroll in 30 years. That's double from where we are now. You know, and you put that on top of that. We just need more of that funding to help get to the point we want to get to in 23 years, which is our bogey of 2047.
Let's go back one, Ed. 2, 3. Where was that drop off? And you can see it right there too. If you go back to that chart, the one you were right here. 51.92 ADEC, 27.8. And that does this.
Right.
What's that on the chart?
2018's line is gone.
Okay,
It's 24 years from now, it's 2048.
that's that fixed. That's what we're boxed into right now, that
That's your big piece.
stakes in the ground.
That's your big piece
say,
of
okay.
ADEC, yeah. That's your big piece. That'll fall off in
Can you not move the
2048.
chart over to where we're there? That won't work?
Just show that, just show the
This is a
25.
play on numbers, so just being optimistic.
I know.
Sorry.
And that other chart still goes to also note that PERS is not a standalone, that everything that happens that affects payroll, number of people, everything impacts it. We don't just we're not out here on our own in a vacuum.
Right.
Everything that happens impacts one way or the other,
Exactly.
good or bad.
Exactly, yep, good or bad.
And yeah, that's an important point. That's statewide too. That's not just state officials or the state legislature. That's all the local cities and counties when they change salaries or everything that's beyond our control and even beyond the state's control to some extent. Good
On the
point.
chart you're on right now, and I see the significant rise in the ADAC that you're proposing and the fall off. You keep mentioning 100% funded. Of plans of this nature, the state's PERS plan, how many of them are 100% funded? What do you consider is well-funded? I know everybody'd love to be 110%, but what do you see across the country?
I know all the Washington plans are 100% funded. South Dakota is 100% funded. I'll look to my GRS friends. Any of your plans over 100% funded?
Wisconsin's always up there.
Wisconsin, yeah.
Understand that some of those, like South Dakota, Wisconsin, and those,
They
they
have
have
it,
other
yeah.
mechanisms, you know, and others are up there in the 90s, like Tennessee, North Carolina.
Yeah, Indiana.
And others are up there, but some of those you see around 100%, here I'll stand. Some of those have benefit designs that, on paper, they look great to be 100% funded, but they can be pretty tough on retirees. And that is the COLA feature.
That was-
The COLA feature to balance
Nice anticipation, because that was my next
Exactly,
question.
right. What
is
percentage?
You,
Yeah.
you have, we're targeting 100%, but our benefit structure is fixed. And that's
That's
that's part of our challenge. But to compare us to other systems, is there anyone similar to us? And what percentage? Because if you adjusted your target to say, man, we wish we were 90% funded, that steepness of that line is going to fall.
Yeah, a blessing and a curse of comparing yourselves to other statewide systems is everybody's different. Everybody uses different assumptions. Everybody has a different plan design. There are millions of commutations of how you can have a plan design. So, yeah, I mean, there aren't, NASRA, we should put him on the NASRA website. NASRA is the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, which Ray is a part of. They have a team of folks that do this for directors, for actuaries. They put together the statistics of all those plans, and you go in there and you look, and you can't compare yourself to somebody sometimes because they're using a 6.5% discount rate while you're using a 7% discount rate. So, you may be better funded, but you're using a more, a higher, assumption rate. So it is hard. So, but the goal of, I bet you all of those is to be 100% funded.
But is 100% funded board policy? Is that why you're using 100%?
That's in the funding policy.
Okay.
Yes.
But, well,
And-
now, it's 80 to 100 is green light. It's
Yes,
a green signal.
correct, yes.
So, I mean, that was all discussions, Senator Sparks, back when was 100% with our plan, knowing how it's designed, knowing you've got this surge of 3%, compounded in some cases every year. To be reasonable wasn't, we got to hit it. It was that band kind of being 80 to 100% in the funded ratio. That's a green light. So a green signal as far as that goes. So that was where we wanted to be, was just in that territory over that 30-year period.
And I don't want to speak for the legislature in any fashion, but I'd like to see that chart. I'd like to see 80, 85, 90, 95, and the ADAC that's related to it, because that may help. Again, my concerns for beneficiaries, retirees, that the messages they're hearing is a fair and accurate representation of reality, which is not always actuarially what we have, because that would be a major difference if 100 was not the number we're focusing on.
Right. And we've built a projection model that can look at variations like that. And I'll even foreshadow what I'm about to talk about is, even though our recommendation doesn't quite get PERS to 100% funded in 2047 even. It gets close, but it doesn't, and we'll see those numbers in a second.
Let me mention a few things here too. One of the things that you all have heard me say before is there's a difference in being 100% funded and not trying to be. So you ought to always be striving for 100% funded. The other thing, even though it was mentioned earlier about the board policy being the goal 100%, which is certainly the case, but wouldn't it be true to say to the board members, myself and actuaries, that's based on the recommendations of the actuary or actuaries and based on, I guess, the actuarial standards of practice.
Exactly,
With that.
yeah.
So it's not just the board doing it. Now, one other thing I would mention respectfully is I do think we have a complete and accurate picture actuarially.
I'm going to stop you just a second. I just said reality, not actuarially, because I can tell you this: when the beneficiaries call me and want to know is their check coming, they don't ask me what the actuarial assumptions are. So when I say a picture in reality, I think if our target's 100 and similar plans have built-in knobs to help them if they get into duress, we don't have those knobs. The one knob everybody keeps saying is more money. So I do think it's fair to look at that, because those same people who call us also want the roads paved, the bridges built, teachers paid, et cetera. So I'm gonna push back a little bit on
Oh,
that.
sure, I was gonna say the same thing in the same breath. I'll say again, I think we do have as you said, a complete and accurate picture actuarially. But I do agree with the points you were saying, and in the same breath, I was gonna follow up to your point, I think you're getting at the way I would say it, is PERS is certainly stable. We have 35 billion in assets, and PERS is stable, and retirees can continue to count on their benefits. We just have to work together long-term to keep it that way. And so, yeah, I see that point, and that was really the conclusion of my thought. The reason I interjected that part and do so again is I'm concerned, even though I know where you're coming from. I totally respect and see and agree with a lot of what you're saying. But because PERS is such a complex issue with a lot of moving parts, I get concerned that others here may misinterpret it, that there is some kind of error or there is some kind of inaccuracy, and that's not the case. But I respect and see and agree with where you're coming from, that, like you said, they don't call about actuary reports, they call about the benefit, and it's stable.
And I'll go ahead and jump to a guesstimate, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong in a minute. Your increase in beneficiaries is a direct response into the fear factor that got popped up there last year based on the number of phone calls I got that said, should I retire? Am I going to lose my benefits? And absolutely not. We want you to keep teaching. We want you to keep coaching. We want you to be,
Right.
You're a mature employee. That hurts our system, not just financially, but you pull a mature teacher out of the classroom, or you pull a mature state employee out of their job. That hurts the state too. So I'm going to continue to be the voice that reminds people of reality, even though I may not always understand the actuarial terms.
And if I may just add, I think the concern, at least from one board member, which is probably a concern from the legislature too, is just to pull one number from one report, Chiron, 69% after 40 more years of paying in with these perfection, idealistic assumptions, 69% after 30 or 40 more years. Doesn't sound like a real good plan either. So at 19.9. That, just saying, that's, so how do you get where you're out of that, what could be a danger zone long-term, to better that without being so idealistic that we're just killing ourselves over it, from an employer standpoint. And that's the balance. That's the challenge.
Yes, so I'll continue on with our presentation. So, this is our conclusion for the val and projection components. Each metric, we kind of went through this already. And again, based on the funding policy, says that if any of the metrics are in the red status, we are to recommend to the board an increase in the contribution requirement, or the fixed contribution rate. So since 2 out of the 3 of these are, that is our task, is to come up with the increase that we would recommend as your actuary to be put in. So I'll read this again so it's on record. CABMAC recommends that the board and the legislature consider a funding change to either pay the full ADEC, or actually determined contribution, of 25.92% of annual compensation beginning July 1st, 2026, or continue the phased-in approach for 5 consecutive years. However, increase the fixed contribution rate by 2% each year until it reaches 27.90% of annual compensation. And if we were to do that, all metrics would flip over to the green status, and our funded ratio in 2047 would be expected to be around 93%.
So I'll go ahead and ask it. What would that ADEC and recommendation from the actuary be if that 2024 projection of that in the future at 2047 was 80% or 85%? So anyway, I know you don't necessarily have a number there, but is that 22.4? I guess that's where I'm headed.
No,
Okay, so
22.4.
anyway, that seems to be the.
Right.
Let me muddy the water right here.
You don't have to, though.
Oh, I do. This is 100%. This is what this is as 100%, right here, correct?
93.3 is
Well,
what the
93
projection
point.
is, so
Okay,
it's not
93.
quite idealistic,
Okay,
but it's
93.3% is the funding in 2047. Last year in our legislative recommendation, we wanted to go 2%, 2%, 1%, and reevaluate. That was what our recommendation was. And to see if we needed to add additional employer contribution to that. And there, we had actually talked about the possibility of it needing another few percentage points. I can't remember exactly what they were, but we as a board parsed that out. We did that. I think that we took into consideration many of the things that the senator has mentioned here. We looked at the cost that was going to be to employers. We looked at, as a matter of fact, we provided legislature with economic impact if you're talking about the cost. So we actually parsed that out. My thought is right now what we're hearing is that same information. Now, the legislature said we're going to go up 0.5% for X number of years. So now, are we just going to go the full amount, or are we going to try to parse it out ourselves? Well, we can look at that, but as the legislature has chosen to do, we can't increase contribution rate. So we can get another chart like this. We'll know what all the agencies, the people that are listed on here, state agencies, university, K-12, community college, county, municipalities, et cetera. And we can come up with that and we can look at that. But realistically, from my perspective now, the parsing of this need is going to fall on the legislature and the reality that the legislature sees. We looked at our reality last year and I think tried to parse it. So now I think that when the time comes, our board is going to have to look at this recommendation with the economic impact. Maybe again, I hear that we're going to have that. So at that point, the parsing now falls to the legislature of how many years, how they're going to do it, a portion of the increased contribution and additional funds coming in. And we had actually asked for additional funds to come in as well. So just as, and one of the parsing things, a senator's asked what it looks like at 80%. If a legislature's comfortable with 80%, I mean, if that's the reality, that may be where it lands. But the fact of the matter is, Lieutenant Governor, Speaker of the House, the Senator, everybody says current retirees and current employees, you're going to get your check. It's going to be funded. So I'm just saying that the parsing of it may now have moved from this body to the legislative body. And I think we've got to decide as whether we agree with this. This is what it's going to cost right now. This is what it is, and this is where. And then this board has to decide in what form we want to send it to the legislature, recognizing that the final parsing now belongs entirely to the legislature. So that would be my thought. Just to get my information in there as we go to lunch here shortly.
I agree with that. And I try not to talk too much in these meetings. The legislature passed the bill that it passed last year that I did not support. The board, let me back up, the benefits are set by the legislature. And the board has the obligation to pay the benefits that the legislature has authorized. And that's all you can do. And y'all went over to the legislature earlier this year and told the legislature what it was going to cost, and the legislature didn't want to pay it. The legislature has had other priorities with regard to taxes, and they don't want to pay what it costs to pay the benefits
that they've authorized. I should say we've authorized. That benefits were changed before any of us got there, but the benefits are what they are. So I would suggest, and again, I'm just speaking for myself, that the legislature told y'all to hire a bunch of more actuaries to fund because they didn't like what the other actuaries said, and we've now found out that all the actuaries are saying basically the same thing, and it costs what it costs. And I think the obligation of the board, particularly now, is to go to the legislature and say, well, these are the numbers. We have a goal, whether it be 100% or 80% or whatever it is. We want to be in the green. I think we all want to be in the green. I think we all recognize that we have an obligation to current retirees and current employees to pay this money. And how are we going to do it? And it does have implications, particularly to local governments and other things, but I think that's the legislature's responsibility to weigh those and figure out how to get there. And I think I've said this before, I think the board's responsibility is don't try to tell us what you think we want to hear. Tell us what we need to know. And then it's our responsibility to figure out a way to pay it. And I think after all this is a lot more complicated than I can understand. But what is very, very clear is the system is going to require more money. And nobody wants to acknowledge that. It's going to require more money. It's going to be difficult. And the longer we wait to face that, the more it's going to cost. And we're talking about eliminating the income tax and other things. This is going to require more money. It's a benefit we all recognize has to be paid. And y'all's job is simply to tell the legislature what it costs. And we're the elected officials and the policymakers, and we've got to figure it out. So tell us what you think we need to hear, and then we'll be there in January and try to come up with the right solution.
While I'm muddying the water, let me just say this one other thing, that we've heard from the three actuaries essentially what has been said here. We're waiting on the economic impact. We're going to be waiting on the different funding points, 80, that sort of thing. We're gonna hear that, so the legislature will have that information. The thing that we cannot do as a board, we don't know who we're gonna hire. We can't survey them and ask what kind of retirement system they want. We can't do that. We don't know who they are. Not only that, we can't survey those that are gonna retire soon, because even they don't know who they are. We don't know how many of those. We've got projections from past, but we don't know who they are. So my question is, once we get through with this, I'm not sure that a tier 5 is so urgent a need until maybe we talk to the employers. The employers are a part of who we get things from, money from, and that sort of thing. And maybe get the employers' input into, this is what my current employees are telling me they want in a retirement system. And when we get that piece of information, that may give us a better sense of where we need to go with an additional tier, if it's even necessary. You know, if we can figure out a way to pay this liability down, the legislature can come up with that magic wand to take care of that in the next 40 or 50 years, or how many ever it is. 9% plus the normal cost, they're practically paying for their retirement. Am I not? Is that fairly close to right, y'all? Anybody? I mean, I just think that we may need to look at our employers to get some other input on the tier 5, because I don't want to make that decision in a cocoon and us just hearing ourselves talk to ourselves. And I don't know how to do that. Don't even know if that's possible. Don't know what we'd ask. But that may be another piece of information we'd need before we finish with a tier, an additional tier discussion.
Well, and Dr. McCoy, I guess the question, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Dr. McCoy, I mean, I agree, talking to the beneficiaries and what they want and everything is great, and I'm a big fan of that. However, the bottom line is, we have compounded interest problem. I'm going to bring the real boogeyman into the room. and that's compounded interest. And we cannot keep affording compounded interest with the way the world works. We have to, in a new tier, and I don't want to open that can of worms right this second, but in a new tier, compounded interest cannot be computed in, because I think we all agree, we got into this problem back in the early 2000s with compounded interest. Had we just set up 3% and left it alone, or they did, I wasn't even here, the 3% and just left it alone for duration, I don't think we would be in this problem today, or we would be a slightly new problem, but not this one. No state does compounded interest except Illinois. And I always want to remind y'all, it's Illinois that does it. And you want to compare another pension fund, Illinois is 30-something% funded at this point in life. I mean, it is the only one with compounded interest. Compounded interest is the boogeyman in this, and we'll never invest our way out of this hole with compounded interest. So I'm a customer-oriented guy. I mean, that's my family, that's what I do. But compounded interest, we just have to move away from it. And so that's, the new tier just gets rid of that.
I am open to discussing that no compounding, or maybe other ways to deal with the guarantee out there of inflationary protection, because that's really what hurts the retiree, is the inflationary erosion of their base pay.
Yeah.
And if a person is accustomed to living on the amount when they retire, and if they can get that and have some protection in the erosion, then, that's kind of where I'm looking at our retirees as they retire, to keep that base amount, what funds their level of living and that sort of thing.
And of course, let me put the disclaimer at the end of that. Of course, anyone in the current tiers would not lose that benefit. We're only talking about new hires going through that don't even exist at this point in life.
All new employees.
Right. So anyone listening, we are not talking about that.
At this point, this is going to be our November discussion. I
Certainly
assume
part
that
of it.
At this point, part of our November discussion there. Not trying to cut anybody off, but it is 12:30. So I don't know what we're.
Well, speaking of that great point, I was going to ask you, would you like to continue on or break for lunch? I do have a few things that I'd like to say. They could be very brief. And I'm sure board members may have things too, but they could always be covered in the full board meeting if you want to, or not either way, but I just do for whatever you all prefer.
Is there anything?
We can defer to the board meeting
Defer to
if
the
you want
board meeting.
to for your executive report, and you
Yeah, I mean,
can
yeah.
add them in there if you want to.
Or as each committee comes by, like there's a legislative committee, but we could do it then.
My question is, can we recess and then even though the board is supposed to start at 1, when we start the full board meeting, continue this and then do it immediately after the
I think we can. He's basically asking if we start at a later time. And we may have some technology issues to consider, but I think
I think he said start at 1.
Yeah.
we would
We
start at 1.
But when we call up the administrative committee for the report, we just.
Well, I think the board probably, if there's specifics that aren't on the agenda, then we'll need to consider modifying the agenda.
However, we're not going to adopt we're not adopting any of these.
I think it's within the scope. If it's within the scope of what's on the agenda, I would guess we're covered. If it's outside of that.
it is,
then
but
we'll need-
I agree, but I misunderstood. I understood Dr. McCoy, I think, let me repeat it this way, to say, could we recess the current admin committee meeting, come back after lunch in 30 minutes, resume the current admin committee meeting, do it for 30, 40 minutes, and then have a board meeting?
At the beginning at 1 o'clock, say, this is a continuation, and the board meeting is supposed to start at 1 p.m., and it'll start immediately following this conclusion of that discussion. Or should we amend the agenda?
That sounds complicated. I'm
Or
looking at
we
attorneys
could do,
back here.
and this may be what Kelly.
Open the board meeting, recess the board meeting, and go back, or I guess.
That, or what Mr. Brilley might have been saying is
Finish the board
just,
meeting and then can pick up the administrative committee after the board meeting is concluded. I mean, it sounds cleaner to me than the other.
Because we're not going to take any action on anything. We've already taken action on the events that have to have action taken up.
that's true, not gonna take any action, so, the only thing I would say about that, I'm not sure about the streaming, but, I mean, obviously it would be on, but as far as how it's set up,
I would
without
say-
checking.
I like that. Let's just do the board meeting and then conclude it after that.
So what would attorneys say is the proper procedure for doing what we're talking about, if they understand what we're talking?
And to repeat that for them, I think what they're talking about is recessing this admin meeting, do the board meeting as usual, as scheduled. When the full board meeting is finished, then resume this admin committee meeting.
I don't know of any reason why not.
Yeah, no.
We don't have any,
We're not voting.
There's nothing to
yeah, we
be
don't have a
voted on.
problem with it, especially considering this is the full board, you're all present, you're gonna continue your board's work, and you're starting a board meeting at 1, but as Mr. Breland said, doing it in those committee reports, continuing those discussions there, maybe
That may be the better.
If I had a recommendation, and you all correct me, I would just end this meeting, do the board meeting at 1, and in that meeting, when you get to that section, continue the discussion.
On the other sections of those
Yeah.
proper committee
Y'all
meetings,
agree
during
with that?
those other sections, we can continue.
Now, it's gonna
We'll
take,
come back to the
it'll take
administrative
longer.
committee. We'll come back to the actuarial valuation and projection and turn Capmac loose again.
As long as the administrative committee chairman remembers.
As long as they're
to
not
do
getting
it.
on a plane and flying out of here immediately.
You'll be here for a while, right?
We have a 3:00 flight. But
No change fees.
we're just about done, so, you know,
How much longer? on
I
this
have 2
one?
slides, so.
We just want to finish that up real quick. and-
Well, let's just do that. Yeah, let's do that.
Finish your 2 slides.
And then any discussion, I guess we've got after that, we could
Yeah.
still work into the other sections of any
Oh,
board discussion could be
So-
after that during the regular board
And
meeting.
these 2 slides are just a continuation of this chart here, just to show to you in graphical form. So that's it, really. And so this is with the recommendation of us and, you know, what the other 2 actuarial assessments have shown, is this really is the 30-year look of your funded ratio and how the assets grow over this time and you get into a better funded position. And this would be the new actuarially determined contribution slide. This is if you phased into the 27.9, that would be it. If, long as status quo for PERS going forward, we don't anticipate really seeing another increase potentially, obviously dependent on investment returns and that and so forth. But, you know, this would be a good number to get to, where you're really close to the actually determined contribution by phasing into the 27.9. So that's really it. I've got risk assessment. It's in the report. We don't have to go through that. We can go through that in November with you all, or December as well. So that really doesn't have any impact on the valuation and our recommendation. That's it.
Because you are going to get back with numbers for 80, 85, that type of thing.
Sure, we can figure that out.
For what the ADEC would be for that. Anything else before we currently adjourn the administrative
Well,
committee?
finally adjourn it, I think
We-
is what
we
the
will-
determination was.
we will, but, well, we're going to adjourn this, and when we come back up in the report, we'll have any other discussion.
During the board meeting.
During the board meeting. So, we will finally adjourn the hardest working committee of the